What if I told you that a championship-winning Formula One car might be just 5 mm lower at the rear than at the front? That's not a setup mistake. That's deliberate geometry. And it's the invisible battle that separates the winners from everyone else. Today, we're diving into the obsession with rake angles and deck height, the tiny measurements that unlock enormous performance. Because in modern motorsport, it's not the drivers pushing harder, it's the engineers measuring smaller. So why does this matter so much in Formula One? Well, because aerodynamics at 200 miles per hour forgive nothing. When you change the rake angle, the angle between the front and rear of the chassis, you're fundamentally reshaping how air flows over and under the entire car. Get it right by just 3 or 4 millimeters and you unlock extra downforce without extra drag. Get it wrong and your rear end is either plowing through the air like a parachute or the front is starving for grip. The teams that master this, Mercedes, Red Bull, Ferrari, in their peak years, they're not just running different setups. They're operating in a different aerodynamic dimension. And here's the brutal truth. On a circuit like Monaco or Singapore, where lap times are separated by hundredths of a second, that geometry advantage can mean the difference between pole position and 10th place. Championship margins used to be won by tyre strategy or driver skill. These days, they're won in the wind tunnel, measured to the nearest millimeter. Imagine the underside of a Formula One car as a tunnel, and the air flowing beneath it as an invisible river. When that river is disturbed, when it can't flow smoothly, it creates turbulence, and turbulence kills speed. Now picture the front wing sitting low and the rear wing sitting higher. That's a positive rake angle, and it's been the dominant philosophy in modern Formula One. But here's what's happening at 200 miles per hour. That angle opens up a gap beneath the car that lets high-pressure air escape from under the chassis. Let that air escape too easily, and you lose downforce, the invisible force that pins the car to the track like a giant hand pressing down from above. Lose downforce, and the tires can't grip the apex. Simple as that. But flatten the car too much, reduce the rake angle too far, and now you've got a different problem. The rear end is wallowing in disturbed air, creating drag, which is like running with a parachute on your back. Your top speed collapses on the straights. The genius of rake is the balance. Teams spend weeks in the wind tunnel, a massive climate-controlled hangar where they run half-scale or full-scale models of their cars through artificial 200-mile-per-hour winds, testing rake angles in increments so small you'd need calipers to measure them. 2 millimeters forward on the front suspension, 1 millimeter adjustment on the rear ride height, and suddenly the air pressure map beneath the car transforms. Downforce increases, drag stays flat. The tires work in their optimal temperature window. Those tire temperatures are crucial. Grip doesn't exist in a vacuum. It lives in a narrow band between about 80 and 110 degrees Celsius. Too cold and the rubber feels like plastic. Too hot and it grains and blisters and falls apart. Rake angle, by controlling airflow and how air cools the tires, actually influences that temperature window. So when Mercedes dominated the 2010s, or when Red Bull found their magic in 2022 and 2023, part of that dominance came from understanding rake geometry so deeply that they could extract tenths of a second every single lap while their competitors were guessing. The driver feels it immediately. A car with the rake geometry dialed in feels planted, responsive, like it's welcoming the apex instead of fighting it. A car that's off? The driver says the car feels skittish, nervous, unpredictable. And here's the thing. In a title-deciding season, with races separated by single points and qualifying sessions decided in the hundredths of a second, being the team that truly understands this geometry, that's not a luxury. It's survival. This is why the best engineers in Formula One spend their careers chasing these invisible margins. Because in the end, championships aren't won by luck or by hope. They're won by teams that understand that every millimeter matters. Let's look at how this actually decides races, starting with Mercedes in 2014. Lewis Hamilton arrived at that season in a car that was fundamentally different from anything else on the grid. The W05 had a very shallow rake angle, almost flat compared to its competitors. Most teams ran steep rake, pushing the rear wing high into the air to generate downforce. But that came with a trade-off: increased drag and unpredictable aero behavior in corners. Mercedes went the opposite direction. Lower rake meant the floor worked harder, the diffuser could breathe differently, and the whole car's balance changed. Hamilton won 10 races that season, and a huge part of that came from understanding that deck height geometry gave them a platform where tire temperatures stayed perfect lap after lap. The other drivers noticed. They said the Mercedes looked nervous from the outside, but on board, Hamilton was extracting grip that shouldn't have existed at those speeds. Fast forward to 2021, and we see the same principle play out in the championship battle between Mercedes and Red Bull. Red Bull, under the regulation changes, discovered something crucial about rake angle and how it interacted with the new low-down force regulations. They ran a higher rake than Mercedes did, and that created a different sweet spot for their tire strategy and their straight-line speed. In qualifying at Monza, Abu Dhabi, and Brazil, you could see the Red Bull gaining tenths on the straights. Yet Mercedes was competitive in the corners because of how their shallower rake managed the tire thermal envelope. These weren't massive changes. We're talking millimeters of adjustment between Friday practice and qualifying. But those millimeters determined who qualified on pole, who could push harder in the final stint. Then 2022. Red Bull nailed the rake geometry from day one with the RB18. The car felt planted even in high-speed corners, the tires lived in that optimal window consistently, and Max Verstappen won 15 races. The fascinating part? Ferrari and Mercedes spent half the season chasing a geometry philosophy that Red Bull had already solved. By the time they understood it, Red Bull was already 3 races ahead in the points. Now here's a thought experiment that really opens your eyes to how sensitive this geometry is. Imagine Mercedes had committed to Red Bull's rake angle philosophy in early 2021, not mid-season. What if they'd said, "We're going higher at the rear, accepting a bit more drag on the straights to unlock consistent tire behavior in the high-speed stuff"? The math suggests they'd have found performance faster. But, and this is the catch, they might have lost qualifying speed during those first 4 or 5 races while the setup window was still settling. 1 pole position per weekend, maybe 2 tenths lost in Q3, could have cost them points early on. Red Bull might still have built a points buffer that proved insurmountable later. That's the cruel reality of setup philosophy. The fastest direction isn't always the smartest direction when you're racing in real time. You have to balance discovery against immediate competition. This is why Red Bull's consistency with rake angle was so devastating. They weren't just fast, they were fast from day one, and they never had to look back. So let's lock in what matters. Rake angle and deck height are the invisible architects of modern F1 performance. First, remember this. A change of just 2 or 3 millimeters at the rear can shift your entire aerodynamic character, turning a championship contender into a midfield runner or vice versa. Second, consistency beats perfection. Red Bull's discipline with rake philosophy gave them certainty when their rivals were still searching. And third, sometimes the fastest path forward isn't the smartest one when points are on the line right now. Now I want to hear from you. Which setup detail should we dissect next? Tire pressure windows, diffuser philosophy, or front wing geometry across different tracks? Hit subscribe so you never miss these deep dives into the margins that separate legends from the rest, and drop a comment. Let's keep this conversation alive in the paddock.